So that's what we've been seeing up until now, but I want to go a bit deeper into this and bring Dietrich Bonhoeffer into the discussion. Some of you may have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I remember when I was living in Africa when I was 18, and I had this book, The Cost of Discipleship, which I read and appreciated. But there's a lot more to Dietrich Bonhoeffer than I knew at the time. And I'm certain if I had been exposed to his letters and papers from prison as an 18-year-old, I would have been scared off completely. Little background: Bonhoeffer, German Lutheran theologian. He was involved in a plot to assassinate Hitler in the 1940s and was caught, and so he was imprisoned by the Nazis in the 1940s, and in 1945 he was put to death by the Third Reich, ironically just a couple of weeks before Hitler's own demise. But Bonhoeffer, while he was in prison, was developing this idea of what he called religionless Christianity. And this is something that maybe our next talk is going to be on the topic of religionless Christianity. I'm going to hint at it here and tease at it a little bit. But what Bonhoeffer talked about in these letters that he wrote to his friend in 1944 was, he said, I've been grappling with this question. And the question is, what is Christianity and who is Christ for us today? Right? What's the point of this for us today? He talked a lot about a Christianity come of age, okay? And here's what he meant by that. In Bonhoeffer's mind, there had been what he called a religious a priori that has always functioned in the minds of men as they do their various work, as they engage in their various disciplines, whether it's science, whether it's ethics, whether it's cosmology, whatever it is, whatever we think about, whenever we're thinking about anything, there was, according to Bonhoeffer, always a religious a priori. What's a religious a priori? What does a priori mean? It's just Latin. It means something that comes first, and it's a presupposition that you bring to the table with you without even really thinking about it. It's just something that you have to presuppose in order to do the next thing. Right? And so, for example, I'm sitting in a chair. I'm presupposing that the laws of physics and gravity are going to work together to make this chair support my weight as I give this talk, right? We function with dozens and dozens, hundreds of a prioris, things that we presuppose in our lives that we don't even think that we need to unpack or explain or justify. They're just there, and they're obvious. And for Bonhoeffer, there was a religious a priori which would always function throughout history, which is becoming increasingly irrelevant, right? And so as another way of talking about this is, you may have heard this term, God of the gaps. There's a God of the gaps that exists, Bonhoeffer says, in order to fill in the holes in our knowledge, right? We don't know everything. Especially go back a couple hundred years, right? I mean, Bonhoeffer lived 80 years ago. Go back a couple hundred years. We didn't know what we know now about cosmology, about the world, about physics, about science. And so people had what look to us today to be rather superstitious ideas about what causes thunder. What's thunder? Oh, that's when God clears his throat. Why did the crop fail? Why are the townsfolk starving? Well, because they profane the Sabbath, and God sent a pestilence or a plague or caused the crop to fail or sent locusts in order to, kind of like in the book of Exodus. You got the story of Moses going to Pharaoh and demanding that he release the people of Israel who were enslaved in the land of Egypt. And he goes to Pharaoh. He says, "Thus saith the Lord, let my people go." Pharaoh doesn't listen. And so these plagues start to visit the Egyptians. There's the Nile turns to blood. There's flies. There's locusts. There's frogs. All this kind of thing. And there is an interesting, now that I think about it, there is an interesting fact in that Exodus account where Moses goes to Pharaoh, because the frogs that was one of the plagues, was these frogs just came out of the river and just like were everywhere, like in their beds, in their houses, in their cabinets, just everywhere, frogs. And each time this happens, there's some sort of renegotiation between Yahweh via Moses and Pharaoh. And there's a point where Moses says, when would you like the frogs to go away? And Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Not now, tomorrow. Which I always thought was funny. There was a pastor in Calvary Chapel who gave a talk one time, a sermon, and on this passage, and it was titled "One More Night with the Frogs." Because it was just, he's pointing out the fact, the sort of amusing fact that instead of saying, "Yeah, now I want these frogs out of here now," it was more, "No, we're good for another 12 hours, but tomorrow we want them gone." Well, similarly, when you read, for example, the American Puritans, I went through a phase for a few years where I was very, very much drawn to the theology and the piety and the devotion of the Puritans, the English ones, but the American ones especially. And I remember reading books about the worship of the American Puritans, because they were, there were these people who had come over from England, Scotland, and Ireland, and were living in this untamed land with what they called savages everywhere trying to scalp them, and they're trying to figure out how to like grow stuff and not die. And anytime there was some setback, anytime there was some sort of calamity, anytime there was any kind of pestilence or any sort of natural disaster, anything that went wrong, there was always a kind of God of the gaps, religious a priori answer, right? No one knew about weather patterns and meteorology, or certain crop techniques to how to grow in various kinds of terrain and weather. And so things would go wrong, and they would say, it's God, he's punishing us. He is trying to tell us that we need to be more faithful, that we need to pray more, that we need to honor the Sabbath more. We're sinning against him. It's this very Old Testament Mosaic mentality, according to which the tokens of God's blessing are all physical, earthly tokens like grain, wine, oil, land, right? And the tokens of God's curse were similarly physical things: pestilence, plague, famine, warfare, being invaded by the savages who had the nerve to already be here when we arrived, right? And so Bonhoeffer is talking about this religious a priori, and he's pointing out the fact that as the gaps in our knowledge slowly decrease through our better awareness of the way the physical world works, through science, through physics, through all these different things, as the gaps in our knowledge disappear, the need for a God to fill those gaps disappears.